I am getting ready to rehabilitate this WPC PowerDriver board. This one's from an Adams family, and these power headers are going to have to go. I'm going to replace C5. I've already pulled C4, and I get over here to C2, and look what we have here. We have a leaky C2, which I've stood up on its end here so you can see it. And it has leaked all the way to the 7812 and then onto the other side of the 7812 to the capacitor at C3. So I'm going to have to take the heat sink and the whole 7812 off, which is not a big deal, but then got to repopulate or remove, clean up, and repopulate some of these components in the zero cross circuit, at least the right 4 of them. And I have documented in the pin wiki. I've done this so many times that it's just handy to have it in the pin wiki to what those parts are. And then she should be as good as new. We'll see. We have a typical WPC PowerDriver board. This one goes into an Adams family, and yeah, I showed in a flyover possibly or earlier clip where I had to rehab this zero cross circuitry because C2, the previous capacitor, had leaked and spewed electrolyte all over this area, and so all of these components have been
Chris, here is your reminder. White star.
And I gotta go look at a white star board I'm testing, but all these components have been replaced in addition to C2, the 7812, and this 0.33 microfarad ceramic cap on the other side of the heatsink. Of course, I always use heatsink compound when you're attaching a heatsink to anything. Anyway, what's going on here is that the general illumination circuitry is working, but nothing downstream of the GI circuitry is working. And the way these devices are apportioned to function on this PowerDriver board and any WPC 89 PowerDriver board is U1 controls these 5 triacs. U2 controls these 4 tip 102s, and only those 4. U3 controls 8 tip 102s. U4 controls another bank of tip 102s. U5 controls the high power solenoids. This is 2N5401, which drives the tip 102, which drives the tip 36C. So solenoids 1 through 8 are driven through these circuits. And then all the way over here on the right is U9, and this is the lamp matrix combined with these LS74s, some 339s, there's a 2803 in here to drive the lamp columns, etc. But what is going on with this board is that none of the functions downstream of this chip are operating. And for each of these chips to work, it needs 2 things. Number 1, it needs a clock signal at pin 1. It needs a blanking signal at pin 1. And then the device itself needs to be clocked when the correct data for this device is put onto the data bus. So the microprocessor and the ASIC on the CPU will throw out a bit pattern on the data bus, which comes in on 8 of these pins, and the blanking signal will be low, I think, and then the CPU will clock pin 11, and that locks the bits into this LS374. And then that drives these solenoids. So to turn a solenoid on, it'll lock an on bit on and drive the downstream circuitry for this tip 102. And then it'll have to come back some number of milliseconds later and turn that drive signal off. Well, nothing's getting across. The blanking signal is not getting across here. So I have a probe clip to pin 31, which is the blanking signal, and we can see it's getting to pin 1 of this 374, but it's not getting to pin 1 of any of these other ones. So clearly the trace is fractured. It's corroded underneath U1. Now, I could just put a jumper from pin 1 to pin 1, and that would solve that problem. But there are other traces that go underneath this device. So I'm going to need to remove this device, ensure that all the traces are properly making and there's no corrosion under there. And then I'll install a socket and replace the device. So after removing U1 cleanly and using some 400 grit sandpaper to clean up the mess that was there, you can see clearly that all of these traces are just fine. This one from this via to pin 19 was a little dicey, so I installed a jumper on the component side of the board. This one is fractured right between pin 19 and pin 20, so I haven't decided. I may put that one, oh yeah, I'll put that one on this side of the board also, and I'll just jumper from this hole to this pin. I did run one more jumper on the back of this board, and it runs from pin 31 on the ribbon connector to pin 1, and that is the blanking signal. And I just didn't like the way that that trace looked. It was a little bit corroded. It could fail sometime in the future. I tend to banjo string my jumpers like this, and then I put a good heavy coat of conformal coating down to tack them to the back of the board. Some people use hot glue or caulk of some kind, and that's entirely up to you. This is just the way I do it. And finally, back on the bench with this PowerDriver board and the CPU from Adam's family. The CPU, I didn't mention it earlier, but I updated the ROM from level 5 to level 7, so the client may see a few things different in the gameplay. Installed NVRAM and replaced the capacitor. This filters the 5 volts onto the board, 100 microfarad, 25 volt, and replaced the header at J210, so that addresses reset issues. And on the driver board, in addition to fixing this zero cross circuitry, I've also replaced C4, C5, the power input headers, and the power output header. There's one more power input up there. GI headers on this board were fine, so I left them alone. So we are in test now. And I guess I should test everything now that I've got this whole system working together. So we'll go across the diagonal of the switch matrix. Nice. And we will do the coin door switches, the direct switches. All working correctly. And we will test solenoids. Now, the first time I tested this, I got nothing. But now we appear to be working 100%. And again, Adam's Family is one of the earlier games, so solenoids tend to go in relatively numerically ascending order. I'll say it jumps out a little while and catches 4 of them over here that are part of the flasher section generally. And we're going to test the GI. And that was working perfectly before because the blanking signal had gotten to pin 1 of the device U1 controlling the GI. We'll test lamps and flashers at the same time. There's 6 flashers on the Adams Family, and all the lamps are operating correctly now also. So that is it. This board is delivering 4.88 volts in a 5 volt circuit. Some might say that's low. I'm not worried about that as long as you have good clean connections and a nice new filter cap. This should be just fine. And then 11.7 is the regulated 12, 14.9 is the unregulated 12, 20, and 70 are flash lamp and coil power. So that's it. Thank you so much for sending it.